This is George Whitten, Director and Editor of Worthy News. It is September 28th, 2022. This episode is entitled Pipelines, Red Heifers, and the Shmitah Cycle. There's a lot to go over, there's a lot to talk about. Before I get started, I want you to understand something. I am not a doom and gloomer. It is not the end of the world, it's a birthing of a kingdom. I am not about trying to make sensational predictions. I'm just looking at events, seeing them as they happen, and helping you understand how you can fulfill your prophetic call. Recall, kings and priests of the Most High God, that God has placed us in this season and this time for a reason. The idea is not to freak out, but to educate yourself to understand how we're to respond. Now, before I get started, I have to take you back, and I have to take you back to Jeremiah and the times of Jeremiah, because when you understand why Jerusalem was destroyed and the first temple was destroyed, it had to do with the Shemitah cycle. What is the Shemitah cycle? The Shemitah cycle is the cycles of 7 years. At the end of 7 years, you are to release all of your bondservants. In the Bible, it has the term slaves, but this is not the understanding of slaves of the 1800s. The understanding of slavery back in the days of the Old Testament were that anyone that owed a debt to someone and could not repay that debt out of their finances were to sell themselves basically or submit themselves to be bondservants or to be slaves for a period of 7 years until that debt was to be repaid. And at the end of those 7 years, the person that had the debt was completely freed of the debt, and they were called to be living lives of liberty again. They were no longer to be bondservants. So I'm going to go back now to Second Chronicles 36, 20 and 21, and we realize that they were escaped out of the sword and they carried them to Babylon. Why were they carried to Babylon? To fulfill the word of Jehovah by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. It had to repay the Sabbaths of all the years that it was not released. For as long as it lay desolate, it kept the Sabbath to fulfill 70 years, or 70 years. The next passage is in Jeremiah 25, 11 and 12. And this whole land shall be a desolation and astonishment. And it shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And it says, and it shall come to pass in verse 12, when 70 years are accomplished, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, says Jehovah, for their iniquity. And I'll make it a desolation forever. So the Lord used the king of Babylon to fulfill his purposes, to repay all the years that the children of Israel did not keep the Shemitah cycle. And this is in Jeremiah 34, and that you should read the entire chapter, but I'm going to jump to verse 8. And the word came to Jeremiah from the Lord after King Zedekiah made a covenant with all the people in Jerusalem to make a proclamation of liberty to them. Verse 9, that everyone should set free his Hebrew slaves, male and female, so that no one should enslave a Jew, his brother. And verse 10, and they obeyed. And all the officials and all the people had entered into covenant that everyone would set free his slave, male or female, so they would not be enslaved again. And they obeyed and set them free. But notice verse 11 here. But afterward they turned around and took back the male and female slaves they had set free and brought them into subjection again as slaves. And then in verse 13 he says, look, I made myself a covenant with your fathers when I brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, saying, in verse 14, Jeremiah is quoting a passage in Leviticus. At the end of 7 years, each of you must set free the fellow Hebrew who has been sold to you and has served you 6 years. You must set him free from your service. But your fathers did not listen to me or incline their ears. They did not set them to free. They did not. And because they took them back as slaves, God actually put the children of Israel into slavery, into Babylon for 7 years. Because they did not release their own slaves, what they were supposed to do, God now had to go ahead and put the children of Israel into slavery to help them understand. And then it says in verse 17, you have not obeyed me by proclaiming liberty, and because of this, I proclaim to you liberty to the sword, to pestilence, and to famine, declares the Lord. And he says, I will make you a whore to all the nations of the earth. And it continues on, and this is what happened, and this is how the cities of Judah became a desolation without an inhabitant for 70 years. But this was not the end of Israel's story. But I'm bringing up the Shemitah cycle, the cycles of seven, because they're replaying themselves out again. And the Shemitah cycle actually plays out itself in prophetic times even now, because there's the anticipation of the final week or the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel 9:24, when it talks about 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, and bring in everlasting righteousness. So this was a prophecy. Now, if you actually begin this prophecy, you'll realize that Daniel chapter 9 actually goes to Daniel 9, verse 2 says, Daniel perceived the words of the numbers of years that according to the word of Jeremiah the prophet, that must end before the desolation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So that Daniel was reading the prophecy of Jeremiah, realized it was coming to pass in his lifetime, realized it was come to pass soon, and then continues the prophecy of 924, and you realize that now he's talking about the last days. And that's why the Shemitah cycles are very important. I could go through years upon years of Shemitah cycles, but I'm going to actually start in modern history so that we can kind of understand how important and how significant they are and how they're replaying themselves out. History is, there's a saying that history repeats itself. It doesn't really repeat itself, but it rhymes, because the God of the Bible is cyclical. Everything is cyclical. We have a daily cycle, we have a weekly cycle, we have a monthly cycle, we have a seasonal cycle, we have a yearly cycle, we have a Shemitah cycle, a 7-year cycle. So I'm going back now to 1973. 1973 was the beginning of when the Denmark, the United Kingdom, and the Republic of Ireland were admitted into the EEC, or the European Economic Community. This was the beginning of the EU. The same year, in 1973, we had the Watergate scandal. And the Watergate scandal brought down Nixon. The same time, right, we had the Supreme Court of the United States delivered its decision on Roe v. Wade. And so now we're seeing that the 7-year cycle, that this year was the ending of Roe v. Wade. It was the end of the Vietnam War. And then it continued on. Now notice this, ready? It was when the World Trade Center in New York City was dedicated. It was the year the Yom Kippur War ended. And it was the year that Richard Nixon signed the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Authorization Act, authorizing the construction of the Alaskan pipeline. And we'll see how the pipelines come again in the Shemitah cycle. And then we had the American Psychiatric Association voting 13-0 to remove homosexuality from its official list of mental disorder named psychiatric disorders, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And so we're going to see these things replay themselves out over and over again. Now, this is not 7 years later. This is 6 years later, because there's also the events that happen right before the 7th year. And what I find interesting is that in 1979, we had the beginning of the Soviet-Afghanistan War. And we'll see that in the 6th year of the Shemitah cycle, basically in 2021, we had the end of the Afghanistan War of the United States. We also had the beginning of the collapse of the economy. It was under the Carter administration that we had double-digit inflation, we had high interest rates, and we actually had, I remember the days when I was 8 years old, and you had to wait in line for an hour at the gas pumps to get gas, because there was such such long lines. And then the same thing was, we had the beginning of the Iranian Revolution, and that's when the Shah came down and the Ayatollah Khomeini came to power. Now, the Shemitah year of 1980, we're jumping, and so from 1973 to 1980, 7 years. We now, at the World Health Organization, confirmed the eradication of smallpox. We had the eruption of Mount St. Helens. At that time, was one of the largest economic catastrophes, natural economic catastrophes. And the irony is, we had CNN began broadcasting. And this year, we're basically seeing the ending of CNN. But then we had the institution of Sharia law in Iran. We had the beginning of the Iran-Iraq war and the election of Ronald Reagan. Now, jump forward now to 1987, 7 years later. And in 1987, here we go. In 1973, you had a President Nixon in a middle of a scandal that basically ended his presidency. And now in 1987, we're having the Iran-Contra affair. And it rebuked Ronald Reagan for not controlling his national security staff. The same situation in a Shmitah year of a scandal surrounding a Republican president. Now, this is also the same year that Ronald Reagan was at the wall in Brandenburg Gate and said to Mikhail Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Then continue on, we had the Federal Communications Commission rescinding the Fairness Doctrine, which had required radio and television stations to present controversial issues fairly. Here we go. We're seeing now the beginning of censorship again, and we're seeing all these things. It's kind of interesting. But we also had an economic meltdown. It was Black Monday of 1987 that the Dow Jones fell 22%. And this was also the beginning of the first Intifada, which began in the Gaza Strip in the West Bank. What we're seeing now in Israel, we're beginning to see these same situations happening over again. Now, we're going back now. We're going 7 years later. 7 years later, it's 1994. We now have the North American Free Trade Agreement coming into effect. So we just had a cycle where we saw the beginning of the euro or the beginning of the EU coming about, and now we're seeing the beginning of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and we're seeing basically the unification of the Americas. At the same year, we had the 1994 Northridge earthquake. Now, the Northridge earthquake that happened in Los Angeles basically destroyed the pornography industry at that time. I mean, 90% of the pornography was coming out of that region, and the earthquake just decimated it. It was not much longer after that it was revitalized. But the same year, we also had Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat signing a peace accord, and that we began to see the beginnings of the so-called peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And because of this, the Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin received the Nobel Peace Prize. The same year, we had 4 men convicted of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. And this will come into play out because 7 years after that, well, I forgot a couple more slides, but we have now Israel and the Vatican establishing full diplomatic relations. We also had peace between Israel and Jordan. And we now have the beginning of the commercial potential of the World Wide Web. This is the beginning of talking about how can we establish the internet. Now, this is going to be interesting because this whole understanding of the transformation of the economy, because this is the beginning of the transformation of the economy into the internet sector. We're jumping now to 2021 or 2001. And now in 2001, we had same-sex marriage in the Netherlands becomes legal. And this is the first contemporary country to allow it. We also had the largest tropical storm in U.S. history hit. And now we're seeing a tropical storm getting ready to hit, it'll be a hurricane. It'll be the strongest hurricane in 100 years hitting Tampa. And the same time as we had the 9/11, events that took place at the World Trade Center. Then we also had the New York Stock Exchange crash. And it crashed. It had a closure of, I believe, 7 days, but it was the longest closure since the Great Depression. Then we also had NATO backing military strikes after 9/11, and that's when the war in Afghanistan began. So here we go. Here's Afghanistan coming again into the picture in a Shmitah cycle. It wasn't that long ago that you had the Russians ending the Afghanistan war in 1980, and now we're seeing the Afghanistan war begin in 2001, a Shmitah cycle, or 2 Shmitah cycles. Then you had the United States. They passed the U.S. Patriot Act into law. Now we're jumping now to 2008. 2008 is kind of interesting. Here was Fidel Castro. He finally retires as a president of Cuba. He lasted 49 years, or 7 Shemitah cycles, and it was the year of jubilation. I was really hoping that in 2008, 2009, we were going to see the Cuban government transition, or something was going to happen. It was going to be the end of communism in Cuba. We haven't seen that yet. I'm not sure how that's going to play itself out. But we see here also the beginning of Russia being involved in Georgia. And so now what we're seeing is the same situation of Russia getting involved in Ukraine. They also got involved in Belarus. So these are the same thing. It's a cycle over again. We also had the government taking over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac because there was a mortgage crisis. We could be having another mortgage meltdown. Then we also had the beginning of the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, which was known at that time as the biggest experiment in history. And guess what? We just had another dress rehearsal that CERN went around again. And there's a lot of implications to that. I don't want to get into that on this video, but do your own research. But then we also had the largest, one of the largest brokers in the United States collapse. Lehman Brothers collapsed, and we also had the beginning of SpaceX. Why is this important? Well, you'll find out that SpaceX and the whole Elon Musk thing is going to replay itself out again. But they launched their first private aircraft in 2008, the Falcon 1 into orbit. Then we had the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008. Why? Because the markets collapsed. The markets collapsed in a Shmitah cycle. Then we had Barack Obama. Obviously, he was the first African American to be elected president. And then we had the worst crash in U.S. history. We're jumping now to 2015. So another 7 years later, and 7 years later, we now have a different kind of economic human. Now, we had the beginning of the euro. We had the beginning of the euro on a Shemitah cycle. We had the beginning of America's on a Shemitah cycle. And now we have the beginning of the Eurasian Economic Union. And it was the economic union between Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. Then we also had the gay marriage instituted in America. Now, what's interesting is that when this was instituted in America, when the Supreme Court justices passed this, and I just realized I misspelled it. Please don't make a comment about how I misspelled it. I don't feel like redoing this video. But anyway, when gay marriage was instituted in America, it was on the 9th of Tammuz. Why is this significant? Well, the 9th of Tammuz is when the walls were breached by the Babylonians, and when the first temple was destroyed. Later, on the 17th of Tammuz, is when the second temple was destroyed, and this is the fast that begins in Israel, and it goes from the 17th of Tammuz up to the 9th of Av, and that's something that I'll do in another video. But also, we had the beginning of the Yemen War. I have a different video that covers the whole Yemen war, but you have to understand there's a spiritual implication to all of this. And so that is the beginning of the Yemen war that happened in Saudi Arabia. But then we also had, remember ISIS? At that time, it started controlling large sections of Syria, of Iraq, and it actually started incorporating different factions. It started incorporating the different Islamic factions that are in Africa. But this was the beginning of when Russia began its intervention inside of Syria. And this is going to be crucial to understand, but then we're going to go ahead and talk about a lot of these things. But then we also have the Global Climate Change Pact. And so it began, committing all these countries to reduce carbon emissions for the first time. This is the year now, a Smi'tah cycle later, that SpaceX is able to land an uncrewed Falcon 9, and it became the first reusable rocket to successfully enter orbital space and return. So there was one Shemitah cycle that SpaceX it was transforming its technology, transforming its prowess inside of the outer space region. Then we also have Israel finding one of the largest oil fields in the world on the Golan Heights after the blood red moons. Now, the cycles that are overplaying itself out again, right now we're seeing over and over again. Right now in the news, it's current news, that Russia is talking about using tactical nukes in Ukraine. Well, this is the same cycle going over again that Russia launches massive nuclear war training exercises with 40 million people. They unveil Satan too. This is all the same year. And at the same time, you'll see that this was 2015 that Russia launched its first airstrikes in Israel. Now, if you notice, it's September 30th, 2015. The blood red moon was just a few days prior to that. At the same time, we find oil on the Golan Heights. And it talks about it could spark war in the region. Why? Well, because it was recognized, and it was still recognized even today by the United Nations, as an area that is Syrian controlled. Now, under the Trump administration, they have recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel. But to this day, the UN has not declared it part of Israel. And because of this, what they found was oil reserves estimated to contain billions of barrels of oil that was 10 times larger than the global average. And they don't know how big this oil field is. The same cycle is over occurring again because now off the coast of Lebanon, we found a massive natural gas field this year. And now we're going to go ahead and we're going to, Israel is talking about protecting it, Hezbollah is talking about taking it, and this is causing another situation of a war. So now we're up to 2022. We're another Smi'tah cycle later. And now what do we have? We have the Ukraine war and Russia. So we have a situation that Russia got involved in Afghanistan on a Shmitah cycle. We understand now that they got involved in the Georgia situation on a Shmitah, and now we have a war in Russia on a Shmitah cycle. So that's a very important understanding to start understanding how these things are connected. We have protests now happening in Iran, and I'm going to show you a video of that. But the protests in Iran are going now for the 12th straight day. And so now we're seeing now the democratic revolution countering the Islamic revolution of 1979. And this is, all these things are happening. Then we have on Rosh Hashanah. I don't like to use the word Rosh Hashanah. It's the head of the year. It's the head of the year that the gathering of the harvest is. Technically, it is the ninth month, or Tisri. And technically, it is Yom Teruah. It is the Feast of Trumpets, and it's the only feast that's celebrated on the first day of the month. In the Hebrew cycle, in the Hebrew understanding, they're looking at the moon cycle, and their calendar is based on the moon. Well, the moon cycle is sometimes 29 days, and sometimes it's 30 days. It's never the same, and it's the only feast day that's celebrated on the first day of the month. And because they didn't know if it was a 29-day cycle or a 30-day cycle, they celebrate Yom Teruah. We're in Israel, Rosh Hashanah, for 2 days. And the reason why is because when they're outside the land, they couldn't sight the new moon, and they wanted to make sure they didn't miss it. And that's why it's called the feast that no one knows the day or the hour. Why? Because you didn't know if it was going to be on the 29th day or the 30th day. That's the significance of Yom Teruah. But on Yom Teruah, what we had an oil pipeline blow up. And we're going to get into that, but this whole thing inside of the Baltic Sea that just took place really could be the trigger for a major war. This is such a significant event that took place that most people don't understand the significance of it all. And then we also now are realizing that the war that's happening in Ukraine has only been a proxy war. It has been a proxy war between the United States and Russia. And we may go ahead and you hear every kind of commentator say, well, Ukraine is fighting for democracy. Ukraine and the Zelensky government is one of the most corrupt organizations in the world. They were ranked, in the top 5 most corrupt nations. At the beginning of the year, he went ahead and shut down a bunch of political parties. He went ahead and shut down, several TV stations that were reporting inside of Ukraine. Now, at the same time, I am not pro Putin because Putin has done the same thing. He's shut down every sort of political activist inside of the land. He's gone ahead and caused major chaos and major, I've covered the number of journalists that have not survived, that have died under the Putin administration. So in this war, it is complete quagmire. My hope is that you're praying for the believers in Russia and Ukraine because they are the innocent victims of a war between two extremely corrupt, you know, political parties or political oppositions. Neither of which is the good guy. There are no good guys in this. And if you think that there's a good guy and you're rooting for one side over another side, listen, the whole situation is a quagmire. We need to be praying for a revival in Ukraine, a revival in Russia, and we need to see something that God does something special in this. And then we also had this stock market crash. The stock market crash that began on Monday, that began the whole meltdown. And so this is another cycle on a Shemitah year, a cycle crash. Now, I'm going to play a clip here And this is why I believe the pipeline is so significant. This is actually a clip first of what was happening inside of Iran. Now, if you continue listening to this or continue watching this, what they start chanting is "Death to the dictator." Death to the dictator. There's protests going on in the streets. They are anticipating a revolution. The internet has been cut off in Iran. There's videos like this are not coming out, and there are massive protests in the streets. It's gone on for 12 days. Is this a revolution taking place? Hopefully it is. Hopefully it is, and so there's not a war with Iran. And hopefully that isn't the situation, but we don't know yet. But this is the events that are taking place in Iran that we need to be praying for. We need to be praying for the bodies of believers in Iran. There right now is so many believers sitting in prisons in Iran. It is one of the fastest growing underground churches in the world. And we need to be praying for the underground church there. We need to be praying and saying, God, have your will in this place. May we see something special take place. Then we go ahead, and I'm going to jump to this and why this is significant. This is something that took place at the beginning of the year, talking before Russia invaded Ukraine. And now this is President Joe Biden. This is what he said.
Question first: if Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
Now here was President Joe Biden basically saying there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2, and they will bring an end to it. This is the beginning of the year. This is the next slide is the Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland, right? Now, this is what she said, and I'm going to go ahead and play this for you.
With regard to Nord Stream 2, we continue to have very strong and clear conversations with our German allies, and I want to be clear with you today. If Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward.
And what she said was, in one way or another, if Russia invades Ukraine, Nord Stream 2 will not be there anymore. And what do we have? We have the end of Nord Stream 1 and 2. They were destroyed, ready, on Yom Teruah. If they were destroyed and it comes out that the United States, and I'm not saying the United States is involved, I'm just saying that in the past there have been threats, and now we see the elimination of two major pipelines. The two major pipelines going into Germany, and we know that the pipelines that are coming through Ukraine are shut down. There's nothing going into Germany right now. Now, there are politicians inside of Denmark, inside of Poland, that are all talking about how serious an action this is. This is not being covered in the U.S. media. This is a potential of World War III. You're starting to affect countries. And if you realize the other issue, that these pipelines are destroyed, and notice here what happened the same day. This is September 27th. This is yesterday. The day the pipeline is blown up was the beginning of the Baltic Pipe. It was inaugurated in Poland. It was the end of the Baltic Pipe construction. This is from the EU. The same day that two pipelines that connect Russia to Germany is the same day that there is a different pipeline that is connecting um, Norway through Denmark to Poland and the neighboring countries. What a coincidence. We're talking, there's things happening beyond the scope of things. The same time this is happening, this is the beginning of the different European banks and the different central banks talking about the need for digital currency. This is the EU. This is the head of the the IMF. And this is what she said.
Where do we stand? We central bankers, we have been operating as a monetary anchor in relation to the commercial banks and the private money. If we are not in that game, if we are not involved in experimenting, in innovating in terms of digital central bank money, we risk losing the role of anchor that we have played for many, many decades. And we have historical examples of period where the central bank monetary anchor was not there, and that precipitated crisis after crisis. That certainly was the case at the time of the free banking in the 19th century. Do we want to go back to those days? Probably not. I would say certainly not from our vantage point, as a result of which we have to respond to the demand for those digital payments in order to maintain the role of anchor that we have been playing regularly.
So here is the head of the central bank in saying, hey, we need to establish a digital currency. And the same day that this comes out is that the next, I'm going to the next slide here. We have Jerome Powell of the Fed making the same type of announcement. And this is what he said about digital banking.
We think that there are four characteristics of, if we were to pursue a CBDC, it would at a minimum have the following four characteristics. First is intermediated. Second is privacy protected. But third is identity verified. So it would not be anonymous. It would not be an anonymous bearer instrument. And fourth is transferable or interoperable. So we would be looking to balance privacy protection with identity verification, which has to be done, of course, in today's traditional banking system as well.
So now we're seeing on the Shmitah cycle, the economy in the forefront. I don't have a slide, but it was in 2015 that the entire UN got together pushing the 2030 agenda. The 2030 agenda was pushed and was set into motion on a Shmitah cycle. And here we are in 2022, another Shmitah cycle. And now there's the talk of the red heifer. The red heifer sacrifice could happen as early as 13 months from now, the different sources have told. What does this signify? Well, I haven't done a video and I haven't explained why this is not necessarily a good thing in any way, shape, or form. Why? Because a new temple is not the temple of Ezekiel. Do not have time to get into that right now. I just want you to be warned and forewarned that this is not the kind of development that signifies a good thing. What it signifies is the fact that last days are upon us. Because the prophecy of Daniel 9 that we started with in a Shmitah cycle, the 70 weeks are determined, are talking about when the sacrifices are taken away. It talks about the reinstitution of the abomination of desolation that Yeshua talked about, that Jesus talked about in Matthew 24. This is not a good thing. But this announcement is happening now on a Shmitah cycle, in a Shmitah year. So that is the events happening right now in a nutshell. It is a crazy world that we're living in. It is not the end of the world. It is the birthing of a kingdom. I want you to be aware of the events that are taking place this particular year are leading up to something. And it's leading up to something much bigger than we can imagine. But I want you to be rest assured that God has got this under control. That this is not something so crazy and so insane. When we look at these events and understand the days that we're living in, now we realize we should have a sense of urgency. If you don't have a sense of urgency about the days that you're living in, then you need to get back into the Word and just let the Word overflow you with a peace that passes all understanding. These times were not meant to freak us out. These times were to equip us because we actually have the only message of hope. If you look at the world system right now, everything's collapsing. There's no safety in gold. There's no safety in silver. There's no safety in stock markets. There's no safety in real estate. There's no safety anywhere. Why? Because our safety is in an economy that is not of this world. That we're building a kingdom. We neither that Rust cannot wither away, or gold and silver cannot wither away anything that we have financially. We're building towards something. And if you get caught up in all these events and it's terrifying you, realize that God had called you to be sitting in the eye of the hurricane. If you're sitting in the eye of the hurricane, you're watching the events around you and you're watching the hurricane wipe out everything around you. But if you're in the eye, if you're in the center of his will, you can walk with the hurricane and it won't touch you. And so my encouragement is get back into the word, get back into to knowing who he is. The days of awe right now. And the days of awe, these 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, are called to be days of repentance, that we turn our lives fresh and new over to the Lord, that we get revitalized, that we get revigorized, and that we come to a place that we say, hey, God, help me to be the best person that you've called me to be at this day, this hour. Help me to be a king and a priest of the Most High. Help me to be that light that you've called me to be since the beginning of time. God bless you all. Thank you for your time. And listen, I hope to do more of these videos. It has been extremely crazy time for me. We've been traveling in the middle of this whole pandemic. We did over 100,000 miles, over 300 meetings. We did not let this pandemic slow us down. We actually went the opposite way. We said, hey, we're going to go ahead and share this message of hope, this message of joy, this message of salvation, that the Lord is coming soon. My hope is that you go ahead and not let anything put fear into you, that you let the peace of God that passes all understanding consume you, and then you'll be able to live these days out. Be blessed. Until next time, this is George Whitten with Worthy News.